Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm Anatol Lieven, the director of the Eurasia program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I used to introduce the Quincy before every meeting of this kind, but I hope that we are now well enough known not to need to do that. We continue to pursue our efforts to promote restraint in US and Western foreign and security policy. I have great pleasure today to introduce a discussion of a new book by my colleague, Suzanne Loftus, a senior researcher in the Eurasia program here at the Quincy, on an absolutely critical theme, which is the attempt after the end of the Cold War to turn liberal universalism indeed into a universal system of governance and management of international relations across the world under the hegemony of the United States. And as Suzanne describes and analyzes in her book, to put it mildly, this was not a universally successful effort. Indeed, outside the countries of Central Europe, it's not entirely clear if it was successful anywhere. And even there, as Suzanne describes, you can see in Hungary, Poland, and elsewhere, what we've seen elsewhere in the world, notably India, the election, genuine election, but of illiberal, nationalist, and indeed semi-authoritarian governments by democratic means. Nonetheless, I mean, why is this book so particularly important now? Well, because despite this, the ideology of liberal internationalism has been used by not just by the Biden administration, but by a large part of the Republican establishment as the ideological underpinning of the new drive to recruit countries around the world into a new bloc directed at the supposedly autocratic or authoritarian bloc of Russia and China. So this is an issue of the greatest import for US foreign and security policy today, for the world in general. And Suzanne's book is a truly important contribution to the debate about this. To discuss the book, we have two highly distinguished panelists, Richard Sakwa, a very old friend, and one of the most acute, intelligent, in my view, and perhaps most importantly and rarest of all, independent voice and analyst of Russia and the countries of the former Soviet Union. And I'm very happy to say that we will be hosting another book conversation with Richard when his next book, The Lost Peace: How We Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War, comes out in November. And our second discussant is Matthew Blackburn of the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs, a leading expert on Russia and also on autocratic regimes across Eurasia. So first, Suzanne will introduce her book. Then the two panelists will discuss it. And then after half an hour or so, I will throw it open to questions from the audience. Please forgive me in advance if there isn't time for everybody's questions. So, Suzanne.
Thank you very much, Anatol, for that terrific introduction to my new book. I hope it is visible, even though I have an interesting background that might not reveal it very well. It's called Russia, China, and the West in the Post-Cold War Era, The Limits of Liberal Universalism. So as the book is titled, is exactly what the book is about. So I discuss identity and interest and norms and the clashes of these in the post-Cold War era. I assess the limits of liberal universalism as a concept, in other words, the liberal normative framework that is espoused by Western powers and is practiced by the United States as a foreign policy that some have coined as a policy of liberal hegemony, which rests on the notion that it is in America's interest to turn as many countries into liberal democracies as possible, even with the use of force. So the book discusses this foreign policy, but also it takes into consideration the neoliberal economic policies that have been applied to the world, and unmanaged globalization, excessive capitalism, and the hegemonic practice of the economic system. The book argues that these policies have reached limits, both on a structural level, but also on a cultural level. And this is also internationally and domestically in the West. What I mean by that, domestically, while these policies, neoliberal economic policies, have alleviated poverty in much of the world, they've also created vast inequalities. And at home in the West, we've seen that the forces of excessive globalization, as well as unmonitored capitalism, have led to a surge in populist sentiment at home, as middle classes have grown resentful of declining wages and living standards and immigration. And the real turning point here was the 2008 financial crisis, where many did not fully recover from their losses. Internationally, from liberal interventionist policies, namely the liberal hegemonic practices I was discussing earlier, these have caused instability in the Middle East and resentment. These nation-building tactics that we've employed have failed in large part due to the concept of national particularities. In other words, not all nations are created the same. They all come from different civilizational and cultural backgrounds, and one cannot expect them to basically become the mirror image of the United States or any other European democracy. And this has created resentment on a cultural level because it kind of has this notion that the West sees itself as superior and is in essence trying to change others to be more like them. So many of these interventions have showed, in fact, the limits of liberalism as being a universal concept. After these crises in the Middle East, we saw an influx of refugees in Europe, which kind of tied the two notions together, that our domestic economic grievances are being coupled with excessive interventionism abroad. So therefore, our destabilizing actions in other countries have then affected our domestic well-being. And then you see this is basically what populist parties talk about, is to be a bit more inward, to be less involved internationally, to prioritize economic concerns at home, mitigate immigration, etc. So contrary to the liberal theories that motivated these policy choices, modernization and globalization, the way it was practiced, did not actually cause countries to mold into a single model, and in fact actually caused or was correlated with their doubling down on their indigenous identity and their indigenous values, in which we are seeing now today the phenomenon of the rise of the civilizational state. We see this in Russia, we see this in China, we see this in India and other parts of the world. The book discusses China and Russia as competitors to the West and talks about how they are influencing global norms by presenting an alternative normative framework to liberal universalism. In other words, there is more practice of state-centrism, so state-centric control over their economy, as well as illiberal practices and more authoritarian forms of governance. China and Russia practice value-free foreign policies in the global South, and this has actually been extremely attractive for many of the countries that consider themselves, let's say, victims of colonialism and maybe modern-day neo-colonialism. The book then discusses the details of how Russian-Western relations soured over time, and this has been due to both normative and structural issues, such as the indivisibility of security versus the right to choose alliances. So this is a contradiction that was never actually resolved in any European security treaty. This contributed to the security dilemma in Europe and great power competition in the form of zero-sum competition over trade and security in the European theater, and which the culminating point was the first instance, the crisis in Ukraine in 2014, which, as everyone knows, has turned into a devastating war today. The chapter on Russian-Western relations serves as an important example of how liberal universalism reached a wall with a country such as Russia. Russia views itself as a great power from a different civilizational background with different developmental needs and priorities. The American grand strategy of liberal hegemony was completely rebuked by Russia. And on the other side, Russia's increasing authoritarianism at home, as well as rule breaking abroad, were heavily criticized by the West. So both of these, ways of being by the other were in fact forces that were feeding the other, leading to a severe lack of trust between the two entities. Russia challenges and deconstructs liberal normative hegemony through its media and through its speeches, and has a very receptive audience among anti-globalist factions in the West and also many parts of the global South. Then the book discusses the rise of China and the symbolism of that. So China represents a non-Western, non-liberal normative power rising through the ranks without adopting the Western model. China serves as an example that one does not need to imitate the West necessarily to be successful, and one can retain their own particularities. China promotes nationalism, sovereignty, pragmatism, and many countries in the global South find that very appealing. China does not have to symbolize a rise in authoritarian regimes around the world or a rise in, God forbid, communism around the world. Many fear China's rise because they believe that China is trying to converge or change other nations into being more like China. This does not appear to be China's goal. China doesn't engage in the practice of regime change abroad. So in essence, there's no need to fear its rise in that case. However, there is a phenomenon going on about norms, an interesting one at the United Nations now. Countries are more inclined to not vote, when it comes to denouncing human rights, abuses by China, just to stay on China's good side, if you will, because of the increasing relations between China and countries in the global South. So there does appear to be a competition for norms around the world right now. And liberalism itself as an ideology is being challenged with China's rise, but this does not have to be a threat to consolidated democracies themselves. The problems that we're facing in the West within our democracies have nothing to do with the rise of China or Russia meddling or, creating false narratives or spreading their quote unquote propaganda, as we all say. It's problems that come from within and must be addressed from within. Actually, China is creating a space for a multipolar world order to open up, as you can see, with multiple civilizational poles, with unique forms of governance. China is already creating many new institutions, also with the help of Russia. And, countries within the BRICS, for example, are moving towards trade arrangements in their own currencies instead of the US dollar, which symbolizes, a global effort at trying to move away from the dominance of the US dollar and to strengthen domestic currencies. We're seeing a competition between a value-less foreign policy and a value-based foreign policy. And value-less is quite appealing in many countries in the global South. Healthy competition between great powers is good. Nobody is judging that. But to the point of getting it advanced to war is something that must be avoided at all costs. And in order to do that, we need to accept rising powers, respect that they have national interests. Otherwise, it appears as though we are not considering others that are not like us as legitimate. And that creates a problem because in the Weberian sense of the word, the regime in Russia or the regime in China is legitimate inside their own nations. The book analyzes the war in Ukraine as a case study about all the themes that I just presented of clashing norms and interests in Europe. It analyzes the crisis through a cultural and structural lens and argues that the binary structure of the Euro-Atlantic space, defined by either belonging to Euro-Atlantic institutions or remaining outside of them, has been constraining and has placed in between states in a position of extreme insecurity. And this is particularly important considering the fall of a recent land empire, as Anatol has argued many times, which is an occurrence which has historically been accompanied by years of ethnic and political conflict. So, in other words, Ukraine had some inner divisions to begin with, which made it all the more susceptible to foreign influence. Prior to the war right now, there was a division between those that sought a singular or monist vision for the future, and Richard talks about this a lot in his research for Ukraine, which is based on an identity completely separate from Russia, and versus those who sought a more pluralist arrangement based on their geographic and cultural affinities with Russia. So this kind of difference in view for the future was exacerbated by the binarism that I just described in the Euro-Atlantic space, which then created, space for an increase in a security dilemma and great power competition between major actors over Ukraine. A European security structure that would have taken the interests of all parties into consideration into newly formed pluralist and pragmatic agreements would have likely prevented the outbreak of major war and mitigated the effects of the aftermath of the fall of the land empire. Interestingly enough, the global South refuses to take sides in this war, which has been framed as one between democracy and autocracy or in defense of the liberal international order. This may be because of double standards or past resentments or just simply national interests of continuing to engage in trade with Russia. We need pragmatism in the 21st century to navigate rising non-Western powers who have their own sets of interests. We need cooperation and competition and diplomacy to prevent war. That should be the goal. Suboptimal arrangements will have to be settled for contested issues. There's no room in the 21st century for a dominant ideology. We shouldn't be afraid of multipolarity. US retrenchment does not equate isolationism. The world will not collapse if the United States does not seek primacy everywhere. We've seen that democracy promotion efforts were rather futile, as democracy is a very homegrown phenomenon. Its consolidation heavily depends on institutional legacy and domestic politics. And in this core, the West should really care about restoring healthy democracy at home and addressing the grievances of its domestic populations, as well as identity issues. In that sense, the United States and the West at large would make themselves more desirable to be imitated naturally, if that's really what their goal is. So the universalization concept of the liberal normative framework has clearly reached its limits today. The global rise of civilizational nationalism is directly correlated with universalization processes. And framing the war in Ukraine or the issues over Taiwan as a fight between democracy and autocracy really ends up just creating global divisions and undermines the legitimacy of different national identities and interests outside of liberal normativity. As such, the global South has no interest in taking sides here. The liberals would argue that this is, the war in Ukraine is simply due to the fact that Russia is an authoritarian regime and a bad actor. Assuming this oversees basic tenets of structural theories that assert that actors act according to their national interests and that liberal democracies themselves have also behaved in horrific ways in the interest of their national security interests. So what we're seeing today in the world is a rise of more multi-civilizational, multicultural, pluripolitical future. And this type of world requires more pragmatism to manage interests, values, and norms in the 21st century. Otherwise, we are just setting ourselves up for perpetual warfare. So I'll close with those remarks, and I really look forward to Richard and Matthew's commentary.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Very true. I agree with all that. Just a couple of things to the audience. Please do put your questions, write your questions in the Q&A, which you will see at the bottom of your screen. You can write them in there, and I will then direct them to the audience. Just one other thing, I lost the connection a few minutes ago. If that happens again, and it took me some time to get it back again, unfortunately, this is always a risk with online events. If it happens again, just carry on without me, would you? And I'll get back as soon as I can. Richard.
Very lovely. Thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this discussion. I have read Suzanne's book with huge interest. I think it's a fantastic contribution to the literature, and we've just heard some of its key themes, which I think resonate with all of us. It's not just in the content, but also the way that Suzanne has framed issues, I think, are very powerful and convincing. The text is absolutely full of, I think, huge insights and perceptive analysis, and written in a very accessible manner, and I think so handling a lot of data, a lot of ideas very clearly and with characteristic balanced analysis. So there's all sorts of things, and we've just heard a number of points which I would certainly say the United States, for example, I think given its powerful status, is entitled to exercise leadership, but that doesn't entail primacy, and so that distinction between leadership and primacy is one of those fundamental elements. And of course, globalization, we're talking about a different type emerging rather than an anti-globalist movement. So I've got loads and loads of comments. I'm not going to make them all now, but these are not criticisms, but they're trying to push the argument a little bit for further, and to test and to try to question some of the formulations. And so my first one would be in the work we have, and this is a common thing, and that is, I like nowadays to distinguish between the international system and world orders, if you like. So the international system, I mean, Eikenberger talks this, but and as well for years, the international system we now live in, I call it the Charter International System, established 1945, the UN-based one. And of course, this UN system, or the Charter International System, is a patrimony. It belongs to all of humanity. It began, we haven't got time to go into all the details of the establishment of the United Nations, but in the bottom line is that it does not belong to the United States or the Anglo-American or the victors in the Second World War. It belongs to all of humanity, and this distinction between the international system is crucial, and within it there are world orders. So the US-led liberal international order is a suborder within the international system. They used to be challenged by the Soviet bloc, which had its own communist ideas. Suzanne touches on this, or mentions that in her book. But with the collapse of the Soviet challenge, it was only after 1989 that this liberal international order radicalizes. It then becomes claims that always had implicitly a universalist claim in it from the beginning. But what after 1989, after the end of the Cold War, it then claims it is the only viable form of modernity. But however, the rest of the world, of course, sees this claim increasingly as a type of usurpation. It's a usurpation in a double sense. Not only does this suborder, the liberal international order, claim to be universal, which of course is a contested claim, as Suzanne outlines in her book, but it also very specifically challenges the primacy of the Charter international system. So it's a type of usurpation. It usurps what should be those norms embedded in the United Nations. No, I'm not saying that those who question this usurpation are themselves paragons of virtue. They're not. But nevertheless, that's a sort of a model. I mean, and therefore, when Suzanne talks about a value free, yes, in one sense, they're not pushing values down people's throats. But on the other hand, it's far from value free. For example, the joint statement of Russia and China on the 4th of February last year, it endlessly appeals to the United Nations Charter and and all the documents, BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, everything. So it's deeply embedded in the values of what of the Charter international system, not those values of the liberal international order. So it's a different set of values. However, I mean, just to make absolutely clear that the liberal international order and Charter internationalism are deeply compatible. Obviously, the United States was obviously the leader of the liberal international order, but also one of the key and co-founders of the Charter international system. So there's much overlap, but nevertheless, in my view, it should be distinguished. My second point would be to argue that the liberal order, over all of its good things, which again is quite correctly outlined, the way it has a set of rules and norms which have been hugely dynamic for China, millions raised out of poverty and so on. But it comes wrapped up in a power system, and that I would certainly stress far more. Those great partisans of the LIO or the rules-based order tend to underplay that power factor at its very heart. And so you have this endless tension between the norms, which are fine, but the double standards, the implication, the selective application. We've got many friends of the so-called rules-based order where it's I won't give names now, but certainly applied selectively. Can I just, given the fact that, to try to keep things fairly brief, my third point is that one point which I really do feel, which, it's also, again, in Suzanne's book, but a point which I'd like to, always feel should be developed a bit more. And that is the tension between Atlanticism and pan-continental integration of various forms or another. I'm a self-declared, and have been for years, a neo-Gaullist, and so in the best sense of the word, in the sense of Europe as a third power, as standing, and trying to define its own definition of security. It cannot be imported, and secondly, it can't be simply borrowed from the Cold War framework of European security. And I think that any long-term vision of post-Ukraine war European security has to address this issue. Macron said it, but of course he says lots of things, but then never follows up, and in fact usually does the exact opposite of what he says. So he says fantastic speeches, the best speeches of our time, but that's the tragedy of it, is that they're just hollow statements. But anyway, this is certainly something which, so Macron is not the de Gaulle of our days. Unfortunately, some of us early on did have some hope for that. Anyway, that's my third point. My fourth point is this question on universalism. Now, it's absolutely the center of Suzanne's book, and quite rightly so. And she, lots and lots of excellent analysis and points about this universalism. However, it is just, I just say, that if you're going to use the word, as you do quite correctly, use the word universalism, there's a deeper power in that concept in our times. And that power and that concept comes from, and I'm afraid to put this to people today, innocent abroad, but anyway, Leo Strauss. And so Leo Strauss's vision of, big debate about relationship to neo-conservatism, but of course, in Leo Strauss's work, you have this very intolerant, monist vision of universalism. And it is not just in form, well, it's in content, this universalism, and in the view, that, of course, that all of ancient history even had this implicit universalism, with the distinction between esoteric and exoteric thinking in Leo Strauss. But, in other words, in further work, one can actually say this universalism has such a deeper philosophical edge to it, Suzanne talks about the political and geopolitical consequences of it absolutely excellently, but as there's a deeper element, and of course that all ties in with the end of history and the sub-Hegelian thinking. But no, that's just a thought. I've got a few smaller points, which one could go on for hours on these smaller points, but I think it's important. Just on Libya, for example, that Libya was, as you quite rightly say, the intervention in 2011 was deeply ambiguous and indeed overstretched the UN resolution. But just to say, it was worse than that, because Libya gave up its nuclear weapons program. Libya signed this economic treaty with Italy in 2008, a very major one. And also within Libya, Saif al-Islam, the son of Gaddafi, was outlining a program of democratic development. I mean, I'm not going to say Libya was going to become a blooming democracy overnight, but these were discussions going on within the regime in Libya, which makes the Western intervention and the destruction of the Libyan state even worse. That's just one point. Can I just say that I think it's important also to distinguish between left and right populism. So you talk, I think, very perceptively about populism and the populist challenge within this liberal hegemony, but at the same time there is a left version which is, I think, very interesting, and there's a right version which you tend to you've emphasized. There was
I think can we hand over to Matthew?
Yeah, I just wonder, because I want to get one more blow in, and that is the Krastev and Holmes book on imitation. It's it's a peculiar book. I didn't like it, and this whole emphasis on imitation. So in other words, the tragedy is the book says that the Eastern European countries imitated thing, and therefore led to resentments and so on, which you describe very nicely. But the book itself is a rather imitative book, which provides even the study itself of these European things is impoverished and an imitation type book, because I just don't think it hangs together. And so it's misleading in all sorts of ways. That book is interesting. It's well written as always, and lots of important statements in it. As I say, there's so many points we can make about your book, and I certainly do recommend it to a wide readership, because I think it deserves to be read and to be discussed for a long time ahead. So well done.
Here. Thank you, Richard. Matthew. Are you muted?
Apologies for the sort of the schoolboy error. But yes, thank you very much for the invitation, and I was delighted to be among the first to read this book, which for me acts as a very timely and needed corrective to a lot of orthodoxies and conventional wisdoms on the state of the changing world order, and the kind of easy binaries and self-fulfilling prophecies and attribution biases that we come across so often in a lot of Western analysis of what is going on. And certainly the time has come for a review of this experiment in liberal universalism, which appears to have run its course. The results need to be understood. And this call for pragmatism and pluralism is a reasonable one. And certainly for me, the subtext is it's a warning that we have to change course in a certain amount of time, or we will face some quite disastrous consequences. And I think the book's big contribution for a wide audience is to really unpack why and how we are misreading in the West a lot of the changes and a lot of the developments. And if we are reading it incorrectly, then we're bound to make bad decisions as we move forward. And the idea that we're just going to go on with these clearly failed policies in democracy promotion, or this kind of unipolar singularity, is just going to create more instability and unpredictability. So I do hope that Suzanne gets an audience, and there's debates that will follow out of this, but I am a bit worried, I suppose you could take this as a question, whether or not we will get a real discussion about this in Washington circles, because there does seem to be a very strong vested interest in favor of ramping up great power competition and winning that competition and containing. But of course, we can come back to that a little bit later in my comments. I just wanted to point out a few of the notions that are successfully challenged in this book and which are very useful. The first one that I would go to is, of course, this whole idea that the collapse of the USSR was about its lack of democracy, and the way that some of the ideas of the democratization paradigm have infiltrated all kinds of levels of our kind of analysis, and ultimately led us to a lot of disastrous interventions which didn't really bring the results they promised. And I think this book is one of the themes going through it that I really engaged with. The others are about this sense, the liberal order, however we want to define it, or talk about its characteristics. We can certainly say it's under strain from within and from without. And I certainly found it useful to come back to this notion of populism as a bad actor that is being blamed on everything for the internal problems, when what is being studiously ignored are common problems to a lot of Western democracies around a fall in generalized trust and some kind of fissures of the social contract, which these so-called populists are attempting to mend. So I thought that was one important thing that had to be mentioned. The other side of it, there's these authoritarian bad actors from without who are undermining the sustainability of the Western order. Again, is a misleading tag. And I think this concept that you've referred to of civilizational nationalism is one which deserves more attention, whether we talk about the civilization state or whether we talk about the idea that culture is driving this. Certainly, there's a link that was, I think, made in the book about how this is also rejecting the Wilsonian kind of principles of democratic self-determination along liberal universalist lines. I mean, that has been distinctly rejected as alien to the cultural context of these countries. And I think it also comes across clearly in the book that the sense that America has weaponized democracy and nationalism for its own interests, in a way that has ultimately discredited some of the Wilsonian notions, which is a regrettable outcome, of course. Now, I also felt that there was a point about values to be made, the idea that the valueless, the value-free, just to pick up link to what Richard said, I felt that China is often coming back to some of the basic, very modest values of the non-aligned movement, if my reading of some of their strategic documents is correct. But I also wanted to point out that the chapter on Ukraine was very well put together. I thought it was, a very detached and fair analysis of how this is developed. And if there's only one chapter that anyone should read in the book, they should go to that and read it first as a takeaway, and then read the rest of the book, because it really does give us a very good overview of what's happened in the last 10 years. There's a chapter on the Western relationship coming apart, and then this particular sort of deterioration in Ukraine, as a thing that we shouldn't want to repeat in other parts of the world. I want to underline that this is still ongoing, that we seem to be with a kind of American policy that is somehow two-faced. There is engagement of country like China and these kind of back channel discussions, but then there is this kind of which is called engagement, and then under this there's containment and this kind of quite hostile policies to China. And that ultimately in the book it comes across that Putin came to utterly distrust the West in terms of negotiations, in terms of making deals, in terms of a reliable partner. And we are a very real risk that the leaders of China will follow the same road unless we can inject some demonstrable respect for principles of pragmatism and pluralism, which other actors see basically as being recognized as something nearing equal partners or legitimate kind of actors on the world stage. So I will just, because time is short, I'll just conclude by saying, congratulations on this book. It's much needed, very timely, and I very much hope it gets the audience it deserved.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Yes, I mean, I have to say, Putin's distrust by now, it's not just Putin. Already by 2020, I was finding that the Russian establishment in general, even people who perhaps still regarded themselves as liberals, had lost all faith in promises made by Western governments and Western diplomacy. I will probably tie some of the questions together, the ones that go well, and direct them in the first instance to Suzanne, and then anyone, whichever of you would like to chip in. There is a question, Suzanne. Does your book discount globalization as a factor over the past generation? And then another question linked to that, given that obviously the dollar as the global currency, the de facto global currency, played an integral part in globalization, the latest round of globalization, just as the pound sterling did in the later 19th century. Is the era of the global dollar coming to an end? And what will be the implications, if that is true, what will be the implications for the international liberal order, to call it that?
Well, that's a very big question. And first of all, I just want to thank Richard and Matthew for your comments. And I really appreciated everything that you said. And I wish that you had been my reviewers when I was turning in the book for peer review. As for this major question, I don't actually discount globalization in the book. I discount excessive globalization, unmonitored capitalism, because as we saw, because of irresponsible controls, we did have this financial crisis in 2008. So we've seen already that unmonitored capitalism is a negative thing. And aside from that, it has also created this vast inequality that I speak of, which I believe could be mitigated with a bit more state intervention, a bit more state cushions and support to the population. So I talk about globalization in the sense that it doesn't appeal to all of the population in the country, and that a major or a majority rather end up losing from the process. And this is something that we need to address if we want to fix, our problems within our societies, because many of them are related to economic grievances. Now, the dollar, still has its dominant position in the world, but we're seeing some trends, specifically among the BRICS, that to try and start trading in their own currencies, and that's really meant to increase the strength of their own currencies, to use it more, to balance the strength of the U.S. dollar against other currencies. So yes, it's a challenge to the U.S. dollar. And it's hard to see what that will do on a practical level to the global economy, because we haven't seen it in a large scale yet. I wouldn't be able to predict that part. But if the US dollar does, sink into not being the global currency anymore, this will most certainly affect the liberal international order, especially in the sense that, the way that it affected England, that when it was no longer the leader of when the pound sterling was no longer the global currency, it's replaced by certainly another one or another group of them, which will then give more power and influence to those countries with those currencies, who will better be able to manipulate or sway or influence countries to do things their way. And we just need to mitigate the effects of complications there, and this is where multilateralism comes in. We need to get together as the international community and discuss what that's going to look like, and what are economic arrangements and agreements that we want to have with each other that we consider fair and just, and that will prevent, increasing conflict between states. Maybe Matthew and Richard have something to add to that very complex but excellent question.
But just to say that on the dollar, it's quite clear the latest discussions going on in the meeting which took place, I think last week, with a new development bank in Shanghai with Dilma Rousseff now at its head, and the various discussions about, establishing some sort of a BRICS currency of one form or another, reserve currency. So in other words, de-dollarization is going to happen. I think Suzanne is absolutely right. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's going to be the dollar is going to maintain its It's Kegel for a good few years, but its marginalization is probably going to take place faster than we anticipate. If you look at trade figures, China, India, Russia, and so on, more and more in their own currencies, because, as you say, the weaponization of the dollar is a two-edged sword, and so everybody's now making contingency. The amount of currency reserves held in the dollar is falling. All sorts of countries are now shifting out because of the way the Russians' reserves, 300 billion, were frozen, and so on. So we're into the. Can you say one word on globalization? There's two things going on, it seems to me. One is conscious deglobalization, which is the sort of decoupling and this the new Cold War. But the other one is, if you like, post-globalization, and that is a more organic, natural process, in part accelerated by the COVID pandemic, where people understood that you needed shorter supply chains, the vulnerabilities which were exposed by the blockage of the Suez Canal for 7 days, what was in 2020, and so on. So, and of course, also the fourth industrial revolution, or this fourth, there's things going on, which means that the old model of globalization, even just purely technically, is no longer so valid as it used to be for technological, economic, and geopolitical reasons.
Yeah, very briefly, I would just add that I very much agree with Suzanne's reference to United Kingdom and the problems it had in trying to cope with its imperial overstretch and its economic kind of, the deterioration of its economic kind of muscle in industrial terms. And, America has a similar problem to deal with, and the economic overstretch and the military overstretch are often not articulated in the public discourse and brought up as a debate issue at the moment. And that's kind of meaning that a lot of the time it's de-dollarization doesn't really get a proper hearing in a lot of the kind of places it should.
A question about American political culture and foreign policy that's been raised quite a number of people, in public debate. Will foreign policy in the US be supported by Americans if it is seen to be primarily divorced from a values-based agenda, or an ostensible values-based agenda, or will this turn into isolationism? Suzanne?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, because a lot of this comes from the domestic reaction. So Americans historically, actually, according to polls, have less and less, supported interventionism abroad on the basis of values. In fact, it doesn't mean that they're not supportive of those values themselves. It's just that it's not necessarily within the interest of the nation to go and pursue that problem abroad. And I would say the vast majority of people in the United States would be open to a foreign policy of restraint. It's just that the establishment is not so open to that. We're seeing that more and more, especially after the wars in the Middle East in the early 2000s. Public opinion about getting involved abroad has shifted. Also seeing the fact that Americans were dying abroad for reasons that were questionable has affected the way that we view interventionism. So I think it would be supported, but I don't think that it would turn into isolationism. I think that's a common assumption and misperception of what this really means, what we're trying to promote, because we're trying to promote, well, I say we when I'm talking about the book, but also the Quincy Institute, is multilateralism, diplomacy, engagement, but on a level that doesn't affect the internal sovereignty or democracy or function or form of government of the country we're cooperating with. It's allowing others to have more self-determination. That's the main concept, but at the same time having even more diplomacy than we have today to be able to resolve our differences in interests, or differences in opinions, or differences in how we govern ourselves to be able to come up with better and more pragmatic and pluralist solutions, which will sometimes be suboptimal, as I described, because we can't all get what we want. So everybody kind of has to give up something to be able to come up with the best possible arrangement to prevent war and to keep stability.
A couple of questions from Canada, I think they are, but going beyond Canada. The attempts by China, it seems, to support certain candidates in Canadian and other elections and to target others and to influence Canadian public opinion. Does this indicate that, in fact, China does have something of an international strategy of targeted regime change, in your view?
Well, no, because regime change signifies that you're trying to, let's say, create a democracy out of an authoritarian regime or create an authoritarian regime out of a democracy. And you can't just do that, based on our elections here in the West, because presumably we are democracies, and all the candidates running for office believe in this democracy for the most part, and will enact these values during their leadership. So yes, China will probably prefer one candidate over another if one candidate is less Atlanticist, that's for sure, because both Russia and China have expressed issues with transatlanticism and NATO and this hegemony of the West. So anything that promotes their interests abroad, they will probably try to encourage. And we do exactly the same thing. We also prefer certain candidates in different countries and hope that those candidates will come to power. We don't always manage to make that happen, but there's something called soft power and influence that everybody engages with, and it's not necessarily illegal, and it doesn't necessarily lead to quote unquote regime change.
Matthew?
Yes, we're still talking about the idea that China does regime change. And again, I think that the whole concept of regime change, as I've understood it, is very much related to things like the National Endowment for Democracy and the idea that the leaders of a country are being trained by a foreign power and being sent to academies, and then the events are set up in foreign countries. I don't believe that China has anything paralleling this that I've ever heard of or seen any evidence of. And in its management of its internal realm, in the management of its kind of ethnic republics, of course, it's not a question of regime change. It's a question of repression and just outright use of authoritarian tools. But no, I think it's very special. The American democracy promotion, interventionism story for the last 30 years is a rather special one, a rather unique one, and it's the book very much does kind of bring that out, that it is perhaps the distinctive tool that America has used in its unipolar moment.
A question about liberal universalist ideology. How is it evolving in response to new developments in the world? Are we in fact going to see a much more interventionist again and rigorous attempt at offensive liberalism to spread liberal democracy in the world? Or in fact, under all the rhetoric, have the failures in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya basically finished that off? What do you think, Suzanne?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I actually think that the era of military liberal interventionism has taken a step back after the failures, and we can already see, even since Obama, this concept of leading from behind, even though there were still interventions, it wasn't as full-fledged as it was before. And now, similar, actions, because as I mentioned, there's no political appetite here for such interventionism. At the same time, though, there is this democracy versus autocracy framing of developments in the world. And the West has made it a priority, or is making it a priority, to try to make like-minded friendships and partnerships around the world, and prioritize democracy, so that the strength of those relationships and of democracy itself can survive this new era and new challenges to that era. So I think there will be much more kind of us versus them rhetoric in this regard, but not necessarily more interventionism in places that don't already espouse these beliefs, because we've seen already that that doesn't really work. And now that we've got other powers in the international system that have power and influence, we don't actually have as much power and influence in some places. So it would just be futile to even try.
Time for one last question for you, Suzanne, and both panelists. Unfortunately, it's rather a big one, and a big question for us at Quincy and for everyone who sympathizes with us. How can we overcome the present narrative by the US mainstream media of democracy versus autocracy in the world?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a big question, of course. And it's through efforts like these. It's through, Quincy Institute, for example, our efforts at publishing our own op-eds and opinion pieces and appearing on the media and discussing a different narrative. And it resonates. People think it does make sense. We have more and more followers on social media, and I've noticed we're getting far more conventional media appearances than maybe in the very beginning, because if you look at the way politics evolves versus the narrative, the main narrative, and our narrative, a lot of the times what we're saying is actually true and is actually happening, and people are starting to put two and two together, that a lot of this mainstream conversations and narratives are not correct. They're in time, the truth always prevails. In time, you see that the proof is in the pudding. So as events happen and as our narrative holds steady, we'll gain more and more attraction and followers in that sense. So soft power, basically.
God willing. Richard?
I agree completely with that. I think that through exposing, and Suzanne's work has done it, and the Quincy Institute does it, exposing false dichotomies, posing things in the mistaken manner. And what we need to do is to say that no one is suggesting that the United States should go into isolation, should retreat from the world. That's ridiculous. What it does need to do, though, is to show a type of more pragmatic, intelligent leadership, which is accepting more partnership. We talked about multipolarity, accepting the concerns and interests of others, and instead of this false universalism. And so, going back to the earlier question, we're not talking about back to interwar isolationism, but perhaps a good old-fashioned conservative internationalism, what I call sovereign international, based on the United Nations, working in partnership, multilateralism. Given the enormity of the challenges facing the globe, climate change and so much else, poverty and so much, we do need US leadership, but leadership which is in genuine partnership, not simply establishing these false alliances, rules-based order against so-and-so and against the others, but to overcome that false dichotomy and working and accepting the world now. The state system has matured, and there's plenty of other countries willing to work, Indonesia, Mexico, and so on. Thanks.
Thank you. Matthew?
Yeah, I'm a little bit more pessimistic, unfortunately, because I feel that the binary of democracy authoritarianism maps onto a black and white moral certainty that's peddled and reproduced in mainstream media and then social media. And that moralism is very powerful, and it can have a unifying effect for a certain amount of time. And if you add on to that, this kind of the Cold Warriors and the kind of Russia-China phobia, you've got quite a difficult kind of few years to try and get your views across without being, accused of this or that, or hysterical kind of accusations that are all over the place. But this is the kind of work we need to do. We have to unpack we have to try and show that, first of all, our binaries are not just incorrect in kind of intellectual terms, but they're not being bought by the rest of the world. The rest of the world doesn't buy it for a minute. So it's also about remembering that we have to convince people, and that's the other way to sort of approach this, that it's not just intellectually incorrect, it's also just kind of not going to give it's not going to achieve the goals that we set ourselves, whatever they are. But I am hopeful that the kind of emotional and the hysterical kind of black and white element of this burns out, as it usually does, and can't be sustained indefinitely, and in which case some sober people will go back and read this book in particular, and the writings of Richard as well, I must say.
Well, we at Quincy will go on working for this. I'm so sorry we are now out of time. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the questions. Suzanne, thank you so much. Congratulations on a most important book. Thanks to Matthew and to Richard for taking part. And please keep an eye on our website. Watch out for our messages about forthcoming events over the next month. So congratulations again, Suzanne, and thanks to you, and thanks to the audience for coming.